Good evening, everyone. My name is Jessica Brinkley, and I'm a Senior Program Policy Specialist with the National Education Association in the Esp Quality Department. We would like to welcome you tonight to the webinar, It Takes a Whole School to Support a Whole Child, Harnessing CEL to Support the Well-Being of ESPs during the COVID-19 Crisis webinar. I, along with my colleague Grace Wong, also a Senior Program Policy Specialist with the NEA ESP Quality Department, will be serving as your facilitators for this evening's webinar. This presentation is brought to you by NEA ESP Quality's Department, which is housed in the Center for Great Public Schools, in collaboration with the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. The ESP Quality Department represents and advocates for the nearly 500,000 NEA education support professional members, also referred to as ESP. ESPs serve as fellow educators in the school community and play an important role in supporting the whole student. Esp careers include transportation services, clerical services, health and student services, security services, custodial and maintenance services, skilled trades, technical services, food services, and paraeducators. Our strategic focus is to elevate ESP careers by developing, implementing, and promoting best practices, policies, and professional supports that equip ESP with the knowledge and skills to become empowered leaders, accomplished professionals, and members of a high-quality workforce, prepared to meet the needs of the whole student. Before we get started this evening, I would like to take a moment to begin by acknowledging that we across the country meet on the traditional lands served by Native peoples. We honor America's first people and all elders, past, present, and emerging, and we are called on to learn and share what we learn about the tribal history, culture, and contributions that have been suppressed in telling the story of America. As I mentioned, tonight, this webinar session is It Takes a Whole School to Support a Whole Child, Harnessing CEL to Support the Well-Being of ESPs during the COVID-19 crisis. Before I turn things over to my colleague Grace, I want to take a moment to go through a few important housekeeping items. First and foremost, this session is being recorded. As a registrant of this session, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to the webinar recording 7 to 10 business days after the conclusion of tonight's live session. To help ensure that we capture a quality recording, all participants have been placed in webinar attendee mode. Although all participants are automatically muted as webinar attendees, we ask that you also ensure that you stay muted throughout the session to help minimize any random technology glitches that may occur with sound. At the bottom of the webinar screen, you will notice that there is a chat feature. This interactive feature should be used throughout the session to make general comments or to participate in various activities through the session. While we have made time for question and answer towards the end of the webinar, please feel free to type questions into the question and answer box feature as they come to mind. We will track these questions as they come in and save all unanswered questions to open up our question and answer time. Should we not have time to answer your question, we will work to review and provide responses to attendees after the session. No question is a bad question, so please make your voices heard via the Q&A feature if you need something clarified. Webinar materials and handouts will be made available in 2 ways. Participants of tonight's live webinar session will be able to download handouts directly from the chat box at the end of the webinar session after you have completed the 3-question webinar evaluation. Thereafter, once the recording is posted on the NEA ESP Archives webpage, participants of recorded sessions will be able to download session-specific handouts directly underneath the webinar description. Due to technological limitations around participation verification, personalized certificates are only made available to participants of live webinar presentations. As a live participant of tonight's session, you will have 2 ways in which to access your session-specific certificate of completion. The first way, a certificate of completion will be made available via the chat box with the other handouts at the end of the session. The second way, if you require a personalized certificate, you will need to send an email to espqweb@nea.org, and that will be placed in the chat box. a few times tonight. That's espqweb@nea.org. Be sure to include personalized certificate in the subject line and the name of the session, as well as your full name as it appears in your webinar registration in the body of the email. At this time, I would like to turn things over to my colleague, Grace Wong.
Thank you, Jessica. My name is Grace Wong Friedman, and I'm a Senior Program Specialist at the National Education Association. We are so honored to bring this webinar to you this evening, and we welcome you all. Registrants to this webinar represent every state in the country and beyond. Every possible position imaginable in K-12 schools and institutions of higher education. You are intensive need and special ed paraeducators, school registrars and attendance secretaries, safety officers, lunch aides and school nutrition workers, plant engineers, head custodians, bus drivers, health assistants, school nurses, and behavioral interventionists. And the list goes on and on. ESPs, education support professionals, make a 1/3 of the entire public education workforce and are represented in the essential work of thousands of unique and critical positions in education. The ESP acronym also means, to me, extra special people. So I want to thank you for what you do for children and students, and please know that we see and recognize what you do selflessly every day, even in the midst of a pandemic. We also want to welcome our fellow colleagues, our teachers, administrators, student teachers, and our specialized instructional support personnel who are with us today. Our roles and positions may differ, but we are all experiencing this enormous life quake together. And so we need to support one another, learn from one another, and lean on one another as much as we can. So today we have brought to you the support, the resources, and the expert knowledge of Yale as we all go on this tumultuous journey together. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Christina Cipriano, our speaker today. Dr. Cipriano holds a dual appointment at the Yale School of Medicine as his assistant professor at the Yale Child Study Center and director of research at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. Her research focuses on the systematic examination of social and emotional learning in the promotion of pathways to optimal developmental outcomes for traditionally marginalized student and teacher populations. As the director of research at the Yale Center, Chris oversees, designs, and maintains large-scale basic and applied research studies on emotions, emotional intelligence, and social and emotional learning. She is a first-generation high school graduate, a Jack Kent Cook Scholar, and currently serves on the Professional Advisory Board of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. But most importantly, she is the mother of 4 beautiful children who inspire her daily to take the moon and make it shine for everyone. And so now, for tonight's speaker is Dr. Christina Cipriano.
Well, thanks so much. It's really my absolute pleasure to be here with you all this evening, and I am so honored to be able to spend this time together and have so many of you here for this very important and very necessary conversation. As Grace mentioned, I have 4 kiddos, and I wanted to own that in my professional presentation today. As all of us right now, we're navigating our responsibilities professionally and personally on a whole new level through this pandemic. And I also really love that my partner's phone auto-generates our attempts at family photos into GIFs. So this is one from last week when we were fortunate enough to try to get away for a few days in Vermont. Our children are 1, 5, 6, and 8, and our oldest has a rare disease called Phelan-McDermott syndrome. And as Grace mentioned, we have a tremendous group of colleagues and stakeholders from across our school communities joining us this evening for this conversation, including representation from all 50 states and overseas. And I'm just very grateful to have you all here with us today. We're here today to talk to you, and about social and emotional learning. And to begin, perhaps you've heard this phrase. So to educate the whole child, we need to start with SEL. I have a slightly different take on this expression. I believe that in order to educate all children, we need to start with SEL. It is critical that we address the social emotional support of all of our learners. And as such, we need to address the needs of our entire school community, all of the adults and all of the educators within it. And that is the orientation which I bring to this work. Now, social and emotional learning, or SEL, refers to the modeling and learning of an interrelated set of cognitive, affective, and behavioral competencies. They underscore our capacity to learn, to develop, and to maintain mutually supportive relationships to help us be healthy, both physically and psychologically. As set forth by Castle, the 5 competencies of social emotional learning are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. Social and emotional programming supports the development of these skills to enhance academic performance, youth development, through instruction in school, and promotion of positive classroom climate. And I'll be going back to these competencies as we move across our conversation today. So as Grace mentioned, I am the Director of Research at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and at the YCEI, we use the power of emotions to create a healthier and more equitable and compassionate society today and for future generations. We conduct research and design educational approaches to support people of all ages in developing their emotional intelligence and the skills they need to thrive. So RULER is actually an acronym for 5 skills of EI: recognizing emotions in oneself and others, understanding the causes and consequences of our emotions, labeling emotions with a nuanced vocabulary, so saying more than fine, expressing emotions in accordance with cultural norms and our social context, and regulating emotions with helpful strategies. RULER skills can help adults of all ages use their emotions wisely, opening up opportunities for us to succeed in work and in life. And these skills are both personal and social. So for those of you who may have been trained in the RULER approach, you may be familiar with the mood meter, which is what you see up here on your screen. The mood meter helps us to identify our feelings and is rooted in decades of research to build emotional awareness in yourself and of others. So I'm wondering, how are you feeling when you think about this school year? Tell us in the chat box if you're willing to share. So we'll take a moment to let folks type into the chat box. How are you feeling? How are you feeling when you think about this school year? Wonderful. Well, as folks are logging in and sharing, I'd like to share a little bit about how, for those of you who registered who are ESPs, you may have been prompted to take a survey upon registration. And among our ESPs who participated in the survey, you told us that you were frustrated, you're anxious, you're stressed, you're concerned, and you're overwhelmed. Now, what is striking about this is these findings are consistent with what we reported. So at Yale, we conducted a survey with more than 5,000 teachers and paraprofessionals just 2 weeks after the pandemic descended upon our country, so in April. And what did those 5,000 educators tell us? They told us that they were anxious and fearful and worried, overwhelmed and sad, with anxiety by far being the strongest and most frequently mentioned emotion. As one of your colleagues wrote, they're feeling confusion due to the fact that the school district is unclear with guidelines. Perhaps some of you can relate. There's apprehension because wanting to assist in the education of students, but not wanting to, get COVID or bring it home to their families. Disappointment in not being able to go back to life the way it was before. As this para shared with us, the best part of the day was interacting with students, and that unfortunately is gone. Further, there is a great deal of concern for each other, the uncertainty in the expectations of what the day-to-day looks like, what the school year will look like, and risks associated with attending to meeting the evolving demands that are being placed on our community. We also found from your reports that there were themes of isolation and feeling forgotten, overlooked in the school reopening plan and in any school communications. One of the most devastating realities from these findings is that this actually isn't all that different from what I found in my research with paraprofessionals and support staff across the country over the past decade. What I have found previously is that ESPs often feel undervalued, unsupported, and overlooked. And we know that these feelings, when not treated, when not given intervention, when not supported, can actually undermine the classroom emotional climate in the absence of full school community support. So let's take a moment to turn to a poll. How is your school serving or planning to serve students this year? All right, so how is your school serving or planning to serve students this year? All right, so it looks like we have about 20% only distance learning, 2% only in-person learning, a combination at 70%, and I don't know yet, just under 10%. For my children, for our school, we're in the I don't know yet category. So there's a lot of confusion right now, and a lot of that could be potentially a source of anxiety. So in the survey that we sent before our talk today, we also asked you to take a moment to think about your experiences of stress and frustration with your school right now, and to identify the top 3 factors that are contributing to these feelings. These results, unfortunately, were not surprising. You cited a lack of communication, a lack of respect from administration, not having enough time for the demands being placed on you, uncertainty about your role and as your role would evolve over the coming year, and wages as sources of stress. There is a tremendous burden to succeed weighing heavily on the minds and hearts of our school personnel, their students, and their parents right now. This really is a truly daunting reality. We have high stakes decision making happening, evolving requirements for distance teaching and learning. We're simultaneously supporting all of our students and all of our families. We're managing waves of loss on a scale unimaginable, all while under a veil of ambiguity about the future. The absolute worst thing we can do for our educators, for our students, and for our families is deprioritize social emotional learning during the pandemic. It is next to impossible to expect teaching and learning, and family functioning for that matter, to occur in a crisis without attending to our emotions. I'd like us to start by anchoring in hope. So in a 2019 report from the National Commission, they called out the importance of the school community as a whole for holding the responsibility for supporting healthy child development. Now, in other words, it is the obligation of all adults in a student's life to creatively and effectively serve the education of every learner. Relatedly, alongside our heightened emotions and mounting challenges and evolving circumstances, there has been this unexpected emergent pathway to educational equity. So without warning, this pandemic has created an opportunity for perspective taking at scale. We are all facing challenges right now, whether it's related to issues of access, feelings of isolation, experiencing what it's like to learn differently. And I implore you to think, can this lived experience propel us to leverage empathy and take action in ways that move us all towards a more inclusive educational system? As we transition from reactive to proactive and preventive-minded on our journey to wellness during this pandemic, it has become abundantly clear that the compounding trauma of this crisis calls for our schools to rethink what it means to educate the whole child and invest deeply in SEL. At the national level, an overwhelming 85% of states are reporting SEL as an increased priority since the pandemic began. And right now, leadership and districts are navigating these stressful and complex times to put forth plans to reopen and stay open safely. Fostering strong adult relationships and supporting children and adults in building these core SEL skills can promote well-being and mitigate negative effects of trauma in both the short and long term. So this lived experience, it's replete with intense feelings surging within us across each day, each week, each month. Chronic, prolonged experiences of stress results in an excessive activation of the stress response system that can actually impede our executive functioning and our memory through this prolonged release of stress hormones like cortisol. If your stress is not managed well, it can actually undermine your ability to be an effective learner, an effective educator, an effective parent, and it can result in burnout. These unpredictable, ambiguous, and evolving nature of the times is both physical, financial, educational, and social demands. They require awareness and differentiation of the various intense emotions that we are experiencing, as well as the skills to manage them. So self-awareness, which includes the ability to recognize and label our emotions, is the first step to understanding how your emotions influence your thinking, your decisions, and your behavior. This is key to self-management, the ability to regulate these emotions, regulate these thoughts, and regulate those behaviors effectively as we move through all of these varied situations. So this skill includes the management of your stress impulses, your motivation, and also your ability to set and achieve a goal. Dysregulated emotions can inhibit your healthy relationships between educators and their students, between educators and their students' families, between family members. If we do not manage our emotions effectively, we will not be able to teach, to learn, or to parent. Thriving through a pandemic requires a healthy mental flexibility that is best accessed when we are experiencing, on average, more pleasant than unpleasant emotions. That's what's going to enable us to find resilience during and after a traumatic event. So what can you control? The first step here is to check your mindset. So take a minute to reflect and think. Do you have a fixed or a growth mindset about the challenges facing you and your school community right now? So for example, the move to distance learning has been disabling for many of us, whereas before we felt competent, connected, in control. We were clear on our role in the system. Now we're confused, we're disconnected, we're not sure. But in reality, there are opportunities to take control of these experiences, to reconnect with our colleagues or connect in new ways, as well as with our students and with our families. And persisting through difficulty to embrace a challenge, at that time, we're actually swimming in a space that is ripe for innovation. That is a space for learning and for growth. So managing these ambiguous and evolving demands requires healthy emotion management by every member of our school community. And we need to be able to employ a range of regulation strategies to help to create the conditions effective for teaching and learning. And it's important for all of us. And one way we can do it is to practice self-care. Strategies include practicing mindfulness, finding time for adequate sleeping, choosing healthy foods, and making time to exercise. Many educators are now embedding these strategies, like taking a brain break, to support their students as they're moving into this distance learning arrangement. We are not able to be available to parent, to teach, to partner, or to our peers when our emotions are not well managed. So consider taking control by managing your life smartly. So build and maintain a routine. Set boundaries on your work hours and make time for leisure activities. This is likely going to look different now than it ever has before, and many of you may have found these routines as you've moved through the past 6 months. What's most important is to reflect on, are these healthy habits that I've fallen into, or ones that I could tweak to be a bit more constructive and be healthier, and setting small goals to get there. We also need to manage our thoughts through positive self-talk and expressing and receiving gratitude. We must have self-compassion. This is hard, and we must have permission to fail and to forgive ourselves and others as we move through these unusual times together. So I have embedded across the slides tonight sets of resources after I talk about each particular social emotional competency or area for growth. And so rather than spending the time going through each of these resources, I'll give you the overview, and then we can access them after the time together. So this is a slide with a couple of resources with an explanation and links that are going to be clickable in the deck that you get at the end of the talk. So let's think about, a commonly adopted strategy is checking in on how we're feeling for our students and for ourselves, and asking them to reflect on, how they're feeling moving through this time. Now, as I had you do at the beginning of the talk today, reflecting on our emotions supports the development of a range of SEL skills. It helps to build deep interpersonal connections and can provide relief from stress, making space for improved wellness and our engagement in learning. So you can use tools designed to help students understand the full range of pleasant and unpleasant emotions, like the mood meter. And students first would identify their feelings, and then they would be asked, what are the possible causes, to explore strategies to support managing these feelings effectively. We have seen so many tremendous examples of this going on in many different forms across the country as we've moved through the transition to distance learning and navigating the pandemic. Educators are reconfiguring instruction to use live synchronous video for class-wide check-ins and discussions about feelings. We can support students to identify their emotions by explicitly teaching feeling words. This is something we do at the YCEI. We help students understand the difference between related emotions like anxiety and stress, or anger and disappointment, because accurately labeling these emotions is the pathway to managing them in the most effective way possible. We can also support students in managing their emotions to use helpful strategies like positive self-talk and practicing gratitude. So recall, the goal is to really help your learner discover strategies that work best for them based on their personality, on their needs, and their culture. This is not an easy task, and this process works best when the adults first check in on how they are feeling, so they can be the best possible role model for children. And these skills likewise can be taught to families to support the building of emotion skills together with our children. It is critical that we focus on how we're feeling first before we are able to really co-regulate with our students, with our peers, with our families. So we need to check in before we can ask others to check in and be available and open to that learning. And I've got some more resources here in ways in which you can engage in the check-in, including our mood meter and ways to use the mood meter from the YCEI. So this experience of the pandemic has disproportionately and differentially impacted schools in underserved communities. These various experiences require social awareness, which includes empathy, a deep understanding of how others are feeling and what is contributing to those feelings. It also includes the ability to understand others' perspectives, especially those from diverse backgrounds and from other cultures. Now, our country is experiencing compounding trauma in the form of racially motivated murders, police brutality, all within the context of a global pandemic that is disproportionately impacting those who have been historically marginalized. These impacts are realized through institutional policies and practices and cultural beliefs and values that assert inferiority of certain people on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, disability, and other labeled traits. In essence, this is a rejection of another person's humanity. And as a society, we're coming to grips with our individual and our collective role in perpetuating these structural, historical drivers of inequity and systems of oppression that are maintained through discrimination. How can we heal and create sustainable change towards the eradication of systemic equities and racism while controlling the spread of COVID-19? Well, many educators, we unconsciously adopt biases and deficit thinking because it was embedded in our systems. We must begin by interrogating our position and building self and social awareness in the forms of racism and ableism and how they are linked to whiteness, to privilege, to dehumanizing perceptions of others. We must reflect on how our identity shows up in our classroom, shapes our interactions with others, our relationships, and our practices. So what can you do? You can educate yourself about discrimination, about bias, and about racism. You can analyze policies and practices in your school and examine who has power and consider why. Consider how and who gets to define what is best for students and teachers, and for all of us who serve our school community. Which students, which educators are held up as best in your school? We can actively listen to understand and honor all feelings in our school communities. We can remind our students and ourselves that we have emotions for a reason. It may be difficult to see other people in pain, and we must be aware that sometimes as the adults, we are generating that pain. When we give ourselves permission to feel the full depth and range of our emotions, and we label those feelings, it can help us to come to understand more about ourselves and others, including what we fear, what we tend to avoid, what we value, and what we hold dearest. Teachers and parents and educators and school support staff, we can support our learning community to process these current events. We can be their safe space. We can understand the personal impacts of trauma related to the pandemic and the systematic racism, ableism, discrimination, and biases more broadly. I've included some additional resources here that dig in further on understanding a broader conception of self and social awareness during this truly sensitive and important time in our nation's history. Next, we need to really take a moment to pause for navigating loss during this time. To respond to loss that has overwhelmed our school communities, many leaders and many educators are leveraging SEL to acknowledge loss, collectively grieve, and support healing through understanding the varied perspectives of families, staff, and students. There have been differential experiences of loss, and that includes deaths and illnesses, services, experiences, incomes, and we must be attending to it to promote community healing, renewal, and thriving. And leaders are engaging educators and parents collaboratively to create supportive strategies for an entire school community that can even be implemented virtually. We have to consider that many families have not been able to grieve their experiences of loss in very familiar or traditional ways as a result of underlying health or safety concerns. We must show empathy and express compassion, and that requires perspective taking in an effort to understand these differential experiences and feelings of others. Actively listen to other people's stories in your community around you. Listen with the intent to understand, rather than the sole purpose of marshaling a response. And that makes all the difference. And this work is essential to us moving forward as a community. And in working to empathize, your emotions can act as your best formative assessment. So our students will provide us with in-the-moment information. Our peers will provide us with in-the-moment information about how they are experiencing the environment. So for example, anxiety might indicate that the demands are too high right now, and they don't have enough resources to navigate those feelings effectively. And I've included, again, some examples here of how you can best move forward in navigation of such loss. Now let's switch into thinking about our relationships. Awareness of others is crucial for the development and maintenance of relationship skills. So the ability to establish and maintain healthy and rewarding partnerships with others. And this includes communicating clearly, listening actively, cooperating, resisting inappropriate social pressures, being able to negotiate conflict constructively, and seek and offer help. Relationships among members of our school communities look and feel very differently right now. While teachers and educators are given, some cases, more intimate windows into students' home lives and direct access to parents and caregivers in ways that were previously unavailable, interactions with ESPs are limited or non-existent, and interactions with students are limited and restricted to very planned encounters. Student engagement with their peers halted and requiring complete reimagining. So simultaneously, we've got shifting household pressures, loss, and we're spending more time together, which requires careful attention to healthy relation management, especially for our households that have limited interactions with educators or limited opportunities for social support and intervention. So we know that our school communities are using CEL strategies to transform their relationships during the pandemic. Remote instruction has necessitated intentional communication between home and school and among educators and members of the school community. Educators are also more reliant on families and caregivers as partners in instruction during this time, especially for our youngest learners and for those with learning differences. And so coordination is key to be able to maximize opportunities for connection, shared learning, and growth. And so parents and caregivers have now been granted access to, in many cases, some sort of technology-mediated direct line for communication with their child's teachers and support staff and administration. And teachers are actually reporting in some cases that students who previously were less responsive increased their involvement because they actually had more comfort with the new technology modality. So let's spin it, right? This is a positive. Now, there's opportunities here for that these technologically enhanced practices will continue to maintain once the school doors reopen in ways that actually can move our practice forward. Now, I have included two personal images here on the screen that would not be possible 6 months ago. So on the bottom, that's my son and my partner engaging with his school speech therapist during school, virtually, speech session. And this was in the spring. And my partner's job schedule would not normally have granted him the time to be available during the day to communicate directly with our son's speech therapist during school hours. And on the top, that's a photo from this summer of our in-home ABA therapist running a feeding session with our son, while on screen is our home-based, so insurance-covered BCBA, our out-of-district coordinator from our public school, and his occupational therapist and classroom teacher from his extended school year out-of-district placement or on Zoom. Now, I know you know this. That level of access required tremendous coordination, and that type of innovation that was simply not possible before this pandemic. And I'm sure many of you could share examples of these types of transformative opportunities that have occurred, although unfortunately we know they're not occurring at scale. I've included some resources here and also point you to a 3-part series that my colleague, Dr. Gabriella Schlitzman, and I put forth in EdSurge over June, speaking specifically to thinking about that transformative relationships and how we can best support our students with diverse learning needs. These glaring inequalities and the prioritization of safety are among the evolving conditions that require responsible decision-making. So the ability to make constructive and respectable choices about our behaviors, taking into consideration ethical standards, safety concerns, social norms, and realistic evaluations of the consequences of our actions. So leaders are faced with decisions about, reopening, not reopening, hybrid models, who comes in the best interest of their entire school community. And educators are making constructive choices about their own practices and their own choices. Families are making choices about how their students and their children will attend to the experience of school when they're given the opportunity to do so. And making decisions during this time feels very overwhelming when the pace and gravity of your decision is amplified So what can you do? Well, you can leverage a challenge-centered approach to decision-making. And in a challenge-centered approach, you identify a goal with all stakeholders and empathize to better define the barriers of the goal, to develop a solution, implement it, and revisit it, because we know that these solutions are not perfect and are going to need to evolve as our times evolve and change. So frame the challenge in the form of a question to engage and acknowledge the multiple systems and functions that might need to work together to succeed. Use active listening. I know we have some leaders on the line with us. Use active listening sessions, including all of your stakeholders, to provide context for the decisions. Increase community engagement and examine the root cause of current gaps in your school community. Use data when available and stakeholder input to create more enabling systems to meet the widest diversity of need. So in your own words from our survey, paraprofessionals wrote that administrators do not value us, and they're not including us in planning as an important part of the education system. We need to be included in the discussions and plannings and trainings. We need to create a culture that values and supports staff and encourages staff to take care of themselves. It is critical for all members of the school community to be reflected in all decisions. Here are some additional quotes from your colleagues calling for the necessity of being counted and included in the solutions and plans for renewal and thriving. So as I mentioned before, I've been doing work for the past decade, prior to COVID-19, working with paraprofessionals and support staff and in classrooms with traditionally marginalized student populations. And I had been continuously struck then by the lack of acknowledgement at scale of the ESP community. So you are the most proximal service provider to very often our highest need learners, or you are the individuals in the school community who have the greatest amount of contact with the entire student body during the most highly social times, such as the ride to and from school, during lunch, recess, between classes. ESPs are an integral part of our school community, and the education of all of our students must be treated and with respect and valued as a part of the conversation from the very beginning and not as an afterthought. And I put a few quotes up here, but I have to tell you, our team was in tears in looking at the responses that you all shared about your lack of involvement to date as a collective in the decisions that are being made right now. I've included some models from across the field of ways that we can think about engaging the entire school community in our decision making, and I hope that we share these broadly and making sure to reflect our full community's needs in all decisions. I'd like to move us into thinking about something we can do as we're moving through these changes and creating learning environments that are healthy. And let's focus a bit on emotional climate. So many of us are experiencing very high rates of anxiety. We're feeling worried, we're feeling traumatized. And a survey of over 1,000 educators in July revealed to us that educators want to actually feel excited, safe, supported, and calm. And those of you who completed the survey for us before this webinar, you shared you wanted to feel appreciated and valued and joy and respected. And this gap between how you're currently feeling and how you want to feel, this provides an opportunity for us to improve the emotional climate. So when school community members are sensitive to each other and their emotional needs and perspective, it creates a more positive emotional climate. And you consider doing this by building something known as a charter, which is something we teach at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. So this is actually a picture of my family on day one of what we were calling like homeschool, because we didn't know what was going on in March. And I was like, you know what, we're gonna start by making a charter. So in our class, in our home, in our school, how do we want to feel? Let's identify that as a class, as a family, as a community. And we put down our top feeling words. Then, in order to feel this way, what are we going to do for each other? What will we do together? How will we behave? How will we listen? How will we make sure that we feel respected? And schools, when we teach it at the YCI, we teach it for leaders to do it first, then to do it among your staff first, and then for staff to bring it into their classrooms and do it with their classroom communities. We also teach it in ways where families can engage. And I've included links here in the PowerPoint slides for you to see how opportunities to do this. So live links that you can click and see certain examples of how to do this within families and within classrooms. And what I'll say is, so we did this beginning of March, and then by the beginning of May, we made another charter, and we made the charter with our son with special education needs, with his care team, because we realized that there were some miscommunications. We were having a hard time keeping up with what they were asking for. They were having a hard time keeping up with all the kind of evolving demands that were coming down from the state and regulations and forms. And so we set forth our own charter together, and we did it virtually on how we want to feel through our working together. What is most important to us? And what are we going to do for each other? What are we committing to be able to feel that way? And for us, it was things like making sure that one parent is available to be able to sign in to one virtual meeting a day, which is a challenge for us, but something that we committed to because we knew it was important. Or how regularly we'll be checking our email to make sure to respond, because that was necessary for us to engage in and be able to contact. So I've included links in here, and also some other links additionally to focus on how we can best promote that emotional climate among our school communities. And what I love about the focus on emotional climate is that it is not contingent upon the walls of your classroom, the walls of your home, the fences of your neighborhood. It transcends space. And so you can build it virtually. It can move into your hybrid model. It can come out with you. You can evolve it. You can change it to a living document. And so it's been very powerful in the research for decades. And I can speak personally, it's been very powerful in my life and those of my colleagues in moving through this pandemic. So I highly recommend. And so lastly, I started to talk about this earlier, but I really want to spend a little time thinking about how we can be promoting equity. With this increased awareness of the systems that are perpetuating these unconscious biases, we actually have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to dismantle, to rebuild, and restore our collective humanity and our commitments to one another. What are we learning about all of these disproportionate experiences and effects across communities right now? How can these differences inform policy, inform practice at the classroom, school, district, family, and community level? And so to move forward, we must be willing to reflect and take a strengths-based approach to change. How can we actively work together to create systems in our schools and our classrooms that reflect everyone? SEL training and skills are critical for holding these spaces, holding space to have that safe and difficult yet constructive conversation that will promote real action. We need to acknowledge the trauma related to the pandemic, and specifically the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on BIPOC and people with disabilities, and systemic racism and ableism, deportations, discrimination, and bias more broadly. We need to recognize the impact of the protests and the response of racial injustice within our communities. We need to acknowledge the role that individuals and school communities have played in perpetuating such traumas. We must deeply examine our curriculum. We need to ask what stories in history we're teaching and whose stories are missing or misrepresented from the conversation. We need to understand the current content. How can you address current events and increase feelings of personal relevance, interest, and autonomy to support true engagement and motivation for learning and growth for yourself and for your learning community? We need to model the behavior and the skills that we want to see in our children, in our students, and in ourselves. As adults, we can look at every interaction with others as an opportunity to teach empathy, to have compassion and hope, and work towards a more positive change and meaningful connections thereafter. You can consider integrating SEL practices within an anti-racist or anti-ableist framework in curriculum design and instruction, and we can prioritize inclusion and diversity. We can place our students and our educators at the center of our decision-making and come up with solutions that more equitably address and respect and support the wellness of those who we're trying to serve. Reflection is really critical to this, We need to be able to reevaluate and adjust as these conditions change, and they will change as we move through this together. And I have some other resources here in being able to dig in further to think about how SEL can intersect with equity in ways that are meaningful for your school community. SEL has played a very important role in promoting wellness during COVID-19, and when it's implemented equitably and systemically as part of a broader system of supports, we know that it can positively impact the evolving needs of schools in in our current school year and moving forward. And we know that the ambiguity of the pandemic's trajectory and all of these structural inequities it continues to emphasize, alongside mounting socio-political unrest and deepening divisiveness across our nation, requires immediate, intentional, and preventative action. We must be both systemic and systematic with SEL. We need to use our creativity and our learnings in real time to apply SEL to remote instruction and forward planning. We must invest in training and ongoing support for our entire school community. We must harness our social awareness to dismantle pervasive racism and ableism and restore our commitments to each other. We must make responsible decisions to learn through this reality and interrogate it and evolve our SEL towards a meaningful inclusion of all of our learners and a truly responsive support for the entirety of our school community. Our educators, our students, our ability to thrive both personally and socially, it really does depend on it. And so with that, I just thank you so much for spending some time with me this evening as we went through some resources. I want to draw your attention to some more resources that are available, and I think that they'll be sharing them in the links as well. But you can check out tons of free resources from us at our Navigating Emotional Times website. Some of the content that I shared with you this evening is coming out in a forthcoming brief supporting school community wellness with SEL during and after the pandemic out next week. And so that will be publicly available, and I'll make sure that is sent out to your network in a follow-up. And then the last thing I want to note is that we are actually launching a free course, a course through Yale on navigating the emotional times of the pandemic. And so there's a link there that you can click the link. You'll see that we're currently it's open and available to folks that are educators and school personnel. So broadly defined, school personnel means everybody in this conversation, and some who maybe not as well, because we also have home daycare providers, out of school time providers. So everyone who is works within a school context is welcome. So all of our ESPs, and it's currently free for all folks who work in the state of Connecticut, and we're in discussions to open that up more broadly. And so I really encourage you, if that's something you think you might be interested in, into gaining this access to this free course through our university, you can click the link, click the follow-up survey, and let them know what state you're in while we're working on making those plans. And so with that, I will thank you all very much, and I think we'll turn it over to a little bit of time for questions. So thanks so much.
Yes, thank you, Christina, so much. This is Grace Huang. You cannot see me, but I'm assuming you can hear me.
Hi, Grace.
So I do have a number of questions for you from our participants, and I'm going to give you the really easy one first. And so Elizabeth Halloran is asking if this model, and so it must be one of the models that you covered, is similar to the zones of regulation curriculum.
Yeah, so we differ from the zones of regulation. And so if you've been using zones of regulation with your students, you would want to look at our work and think about how the colors could potentially be complicated. But there are underlying principles in practice that are quite similar and able to crosswalk well. And so we actually provide resources for that on our website to help folks kind of navigate it, because it is something that we encounter quite a bit.
Okay, well, that was easy, right?
Yeah.
Now we have one that kind of brought me to tears, actually, so it's a little hard. But so Tina McClory is asking if you have any suggestions on how ESPs, or really any educators, might live with the guilt of possibly exposing students and children to the virus. Like how could they cope with that? I know it's a
So,
hard one,
it
but
is
I'm sure a lot of our ESPs and a lot of educators are thinking about that, right now.
And to be frank, it's a very hard question to answer, because my personal opinion is that everyone has been put in a situation they shouldn't be to even have to navigate it.
Right.
So just like want to lay that out there. If you are in a position where you have to navigate it, you need to know that you were not choosing to do so. And so it can be thought about as something that, just like it would not be chosen if you were to have picked up any other sickness or illness in any other interaction that you were in where you were not choosing so.
Right.
Right. And so leaning on those thoughts that, if you were to go to a doctor's appointment during a non-COVID time and pick up something that you brought home or you brought to someone else or brought into work that you were not aware about.
Right.
So similarly so.
Right.
But I say that under the larger context,
yeah.
that this is an impossible and very unfortunate circumstance that our educators and our entire school communities have been put in.
Yeah. Okay, so this one's kind of rough too. And actually,
it's a rough time. This is a rough time. So.
And it's actually somewhat related to the question I just asked you, which is there is someone who is thinking about how they might address their littles when they are anxious or uncomfortable about returning to school. When, how are they supposed to address it when for the educators themselves, the ESP, they themselves are experiencing this for the first time?
Yeah, so we know that we're not available to learn and we're not available to teach when we don't feel safe, right? It hijacks our limbic system.
Right.
And so we need to own that. So if we're not feeling safe, it's going to show up. Right. So we talk about how it shows up, your anxiety shows up in the classroom. This was prior to the pandemic. We know this, right? That educators, and we bring this into our classrooms, we bring this into our rides in the car or in the bus, we bring this into our home lives. And so we need to own it. So we think about emotional intelligence, you need to own that. You need to label it and say, I don't feel safe right now. And so I'm going to enact my strategies. What strategies do I have available to make myself feel and help myself feel and manage these emotions as safe as I possibly can be? And I'm going to share that, especially talking about younger, I'm going to share that with my children, with my students, right? And so again, developmental abilities, there's a lot of things at play, so I don't want to give any too broad examples, but letting them know, this is, I'm wearing a mask right now because it helps to keep me safe, and I'm washing my hands, it helps to keep me safe, and we're going to do that, and continuously reminding us. For many it would be one way to go about it. But you need to own that, because it will manifest in ways that are unhealthy in the classroom and undermine the ability for teaching and learning to occur.
Right. Well, I think that is actually our final question.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Thank you so much. So before we kind of move on to the conclusion and evaluation, I was just wondering if you had any final comments or parting words.
Well, I just want to thank you all again for this huge turnout, and thank you so much for taking the time to learn with us today. I'm really excited for you to have access to resources and to continue to engage in these conversations, and know that you are not forgotten, you are not overlooked, you are absolutely a part of this conversation, and know that my team and the data that we've collected through this experience, we're going to be sharing it broadly. So you'll be seeing those reports go out, and we'll be continuously to support decision-making that is really reflective of the entirety of the school community. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Well, I want to thank all the participants, and we are going to move on to Jessica Brinkley, to my colleague. But before we move on, I just want to say again, thank you to everyone, and please be kind to yourself and to one another. Thank you.
So thank you so much. This will conclude the question and answer portion of tonight's webinar. And we really appreciate you all having such an active participation in this presentation. As you know, this pandemic is having a devastating impact on our students, educators, and especially our communities of color. In times like these, we depend on the stability and support our public schools, public health systems, and public safety nets provide. These services form a network of support that help our communities grow and thrive, and now face devastating cuts due to the economic downturn. Whether we are Black or white, Latino or Asian, Indigenous or immigrant, we must stand united to ensure our health, safety, and future success. That is why the NEA has launched a national campaign to demand that Congress respect the work educators do, that they keep our students, communities, and colleagues safe, that they support our families and remove barriers for our collective participation and voice, no exceptions. Congress can do this by immediately passing legislation that stabilizes funding for public education in the upcoming school year, as well as addressing inequities impacting our students' opportunities and provide the necessary resources to protect our students and educators as they re-enter our nation's public schools. This moment calls on us to go all in for all of us. If you would like to be part of this call to Congress, visit nea.org/COVID action, and you'll see that right there at the bottom of the screen to see how you can be a part of the action. To request a general session-specific certificate of completion as a participant of a recorded session, please send your request by email to espqweb@nea.org. All requests must include the session title and the on-screen certificate of completion code. Session certificates will not be provided if your viewer code is not included in the email request. Note, due to limitations in our ability to track attendance after live sessions, requests for personalized certificates will only be provided for participants of live webinars whose attendance can be verified. The certificate received for viewing recorded sessions will be session specific, but will not include personalized names. We would like to thank you for taking the time to participate this evening. There are many ways that you can continue to stay engaged on topics such as today's discussion. One resource is by joining NEA's Ed Communities. Ed Communities is NEA's online professional learning community, which allows educators to collaborate on issues important to them, share resources and ideas, network, and more. You don't have to be a member to join. You can search content by group names, by topic, and create your own group and invite colleagues across the country to collaborate with you on your desired topic. The link to this resource can be found right here on the screen. That's mynea360.org. We also encourage you to regularly visit the NEA ESP Professional Development webpage to stay up to date on upcoming webinar presentations and to take advantage of previously recorded professional development. As a reminder, a link to this session recording will be sent out to all session registrants 7 to 10 business days after tonight's recording. On behalf of the Center for Great Public Schools, NEA's ESP Quality Department, I would like to once again thank Dr. Christina Cipriano and the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence for tonight's webinar presentation. And I thank you all for your participation this evening. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night from NEA ESP Quality Department.